Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here tonight. We're glad to have you. I'm Barbara Lane. I'm the Director of Arts and Ideas here at the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco. Please take a moment, turn off your cell phones. You will have an opportunity to buy books signed by Paul Goldberger following tonight's program. Our good friends from Books Inc. are here selling books. We celebrate San Francisco's fine independent bookstores, so take advantage of the opportunity to buy a book from Books Inc. and Paul Goldberger will sign. The last program in our 2011-12 season is coming up on June 12th. Christopher Buckley will be here. Very funny guy, the author of Thank You for Not Smoking, and he has a new novel. So put that on your calendar. And by the way, we are now booking for the fall season. We have some really great stuff. I'll just leak one name, Patti Smith. Okay, so yeah, like that. So be sure and get your tickets early for the fall. They're not available yet, but be watching your email for that. I think that's all of the housekeeping. Oh, questions. You will have an opportunity to ask questions tonight. Our staff will be in the audience with microphones. Please wait for the microphone to come to you so your questions are audible to everybody here. And also on the air, we have a weekly public radio program on KALW 91.7 FM. It's called Bina, and this show will be broadcast there. I forget when, so I'm sorry. I don't know. And by the way, we're not going to say this on radio, but Allison Arieff, who's interviewing Paul Goldberger tonight, is wearing the most fabulous shoes, and he is wearing the most fabulous socks, so take note. Okay. Now for tonight's program. Paul Goldberger has been called the leading figure in architecture criticism. Now a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, he served for 15 years as architecture critic for The New Yorker, where he wrote the magazine's celebrated Skyline column. Formerly dean of the Parsons School of Design, he began his career at the New York Times, where in 1984, his architecture criticism was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Distinguished Criticism. Paul Goldberger is the author of Why Architecture Matters, Building Up and Tearing Down, Reflections on the Age of Architecture, Christo and Jean-Claude, and Up from Zero, Politics, Architecture, and the Rebuilding of New York, among other works. He's at work on a full-length biography of the architect Frank Gehry, and I can't wait for that. Paul Goldberger has taught at Yale, the University of California at Berkeley, and the New School, and received awards too numerous to mention. We asked him here to help us celebrate, along with other civic and cultural institutions, the 75th anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge. But of course, his wide expertise will take us beyond the bridge to consider broader questions about the current state of contemporary architecture. In conversation with Paul Goldberger tonight is Allison Arieff. She's with SPUR, San Francisco Planning and Urban Research Association. Please join me in welcoming Paul Goldberger and Allison Arieff to the JCCSF.
I've done a lot of things in my life, but never been interviewed by someone in pink shoes before.
Well, I'm glad to be that first for you.
Absolutely.
So lots of things to talk about tonight. Right. Initially, we were brought together to talk about the 75th anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge.
Right.
So we can start there. Traditionally, iconic infrastructure like the Golden Gate Bridge or the Trans-America Pyramid or the Chrysler Building have really helped define the culture of cities. But today, cities are still trying really hard to bring in these sort of icons like the Calatrava Museum in Milwaukee or the Libeskind Museum in Denver, or any number of high profiles in, shall we say, second-tier cities. But it doesn't feel like they're having the same impact. Why is that?
Well, we could maybe say because they're not as good. I don't know. But I mean, I think the Golden Gate Bridge is in a category almost by itself. I mean, and remember, part of what makes it so extraordinary is that it is a part of daily life here as well as a great work of art. And it's always struck me as one of those things that doesn't try too hard.
Right.
And that's part of why it's so good, is that, it's just being a bridge, taking people every day back and forth between Marin and the city, and part of normal daily life, and yet at the same time it's this sort of almost transcendent aesthetic experience. And it's able to be both of these things at once. I've always thought of this bridge also as one of the only man-made things I've ever seen anywhere in the world that makes a natural site more beautiful. I mean, there really is almost nothing else like that. I mean, when you start with an extraordinary, beautiful piece of nature, which the Golden Gate is, and then add a man-made object to it, it almost invariably diminishes that object. And the Golden Gate is one of the only places I can think of in which it's actually more beautiful, and in which if you imagine it without the bridge, it doesn't become better, it becomes diminished without the bridge. And that's sort of an extraordinary thing. I love also about it that it has just this sort of subtle, delicate little bit of Art Deco to it without being too stylized. And that's another part of the feeling that it doesn't try too hard, that it just kind of is in this beautiful, graceful, unself-conscious way. And then there's the magic of the color, which, as you know, is sort of unlike your shoes, is sort of a historical accident. It's sort of...
my shoes will go down as a historical.
Right. It's sort of, no, I think your shoes are a consciously intended thing, which is wonderful, but although I guess we should be very grateful that the bridge is not the same color as your shoes, but the bridge,
Oh, you didn't know that's what they're doing for the anniversary?
for the 75th, it's going to be pink. No, but that color was the primer color, and somebody had the genius to say, stop. It's okay as it is, and it's not going to be better if we cover it in silver or black or what have you. In a way, it's sort of like the same rather brilliant moment when somebody said about the George Washington Bridge in the Hudson River in New York, which was, is that beautiful steel frame that was supposed to be covered in stone and be a very traditional, elaborate stone arch designed by Cass Gilbert, who's a wonderful architect. And when they got to the point of finishing the frame, again, somebody had the brilliance of saying, stop, it's really finished. Don't keep going, you're only going to screw it up. And they did, and it's always been that wonderful thing ever since. So sometimes, the greatness of an icon is part luck, I think. And I think in the case of the Golden Gate Bridge, there was a great combination of engineering skill, design skill, and luck. And not, as I said, not actually trying too hard. And we're all the better for it.
It's interesting. I spent a lot of today looking at an aerial painting from 1896 of sort of the region from here up to, say, Vallejo pre-Golden Gate Bridge. And I think when you see that photograph without it there, it just becomes all that much more amazing because there was nothing there. So.
Right. But also, I mean, isn't it amazing that it didn't make it worse?
Yeah, absolutely. That it just, like you said, sort of enhanced things.
When is there a man-made structure added to a beautiful natural setting that actually improves it? There have to be a few other examples, but I can't even think of one offhand.
Yeah, no, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Well, we've been talking a bit about icons and say Bilbao or the High Line, and I think it's interesting to me, and apologies, Paul and I did have a conversation about these things last night, but I will fast forward to that and say something like Bilbao became this, the Guggenheim in Bilbao, Spain, became this iconic piece of architecture, and then every other city felt that they also needed to do that same thing, now I feel like the High Line has become this amazing piece of iconic architecture in New York, and I feel like every 2 weeks I get a press release from another city, Chicago, Philadelphia, even San Francisco. They're going to a proposal to use the discarded materials from the Bay Bridge to build a High Line here. I mean, it's a fantasy project, but
Right.
But is it the right strategy for a city to say, "Oh, this works so great here, let's do it here," and it will work that well?
It's usually not the right strategy, in fact. Bilbao, I would not want to diminish the architectural brilliance of Bilbao. Nevertheless, there was also a certain amount of luck connected to that. It was exactly the right moment in the sort of arc of Frank Gehry's career. You had the government of the Basque region of Spain eager to assert its identity and prepared to spend a lot of money, and yet not so nationalist as to be unwilling to turn to another country and use its artistic genius. You had the Guggenheim Museum as an institution that had worldwide ambitions and wanted to work in tandem with them, and you had this actually rather neat industrial city that had hard times, but had actually already begun to turn around, and you could build on the beginning momentum and really push it forward a lot. So all those, it was sort of, the stars were in alignment, you might say, in a particular way at Bilbao. That is fantastic. And I say this not to diminish the achievement of it, which is great, but to say that it took, for a result that good, it took a combination of genius, hard work, and good luck. You need all of those, I think, to have that great a result. And I think the High Line in New York is the same thing. I mean, it was an incredible coincidence of great circumstances there. This amazing artifact of this elevated freight line that just happened to be going through what was already becoming the coolest neighborhood in Manhattan anyway. So it's not as though it was in the South Bronx. Right. It was, in Chelsea, and that's a whole different
they're
thing.
probably planning one too.
Well, I'm sure they now think they can do it, and you can't. And you had these, two young guys who didn't know each other, who met at a community meeting that was called to talk about the future of the High Line, discovered they were the only two people who wanted to save it, and everybody else had gone to the meeting to say, how quickly can we tear it down? They were not urban planners, they were not architects, they were not landscape architects, and they were not political people. And they had no experience in development, fundraising, or anything else. One was a freelance writer, the other was a not successful artist who was working for a computer company. And somehow they said, gee, maybe we could do something. Can we start an organization and save it? And they said, sure, let's do it. And that became Friends of the High Line, which has now succeeded in saving it, redoing it by Diller and Scofidio and Field Operations. It's a brilliant design. It's now the hottest nonprofit charity in New York, practically. They have a budget of tens of millions of dollars a year, and it's so that there too there was a certain amount of luck and skill. I think it's also, by the way, a great testament to the importance of not having the right credentials sometimes, because I think any architect or any person with political experience in New York, or historic preservation experience, or anything else, or would have gone and looked at that thing and said, this is impossible. You are never going to do this. There is no way this can happen. But these guys didn't know any better. So they actually just kept pushing, and it happened. And it's, now this, as you've said, this sort of model for the whole world. And everybody wants to do it. But I don't know that you can count on having that convolution or of circumstances, that same coincidence of amazing circumstances. I particularly love the High Line because it's one of the only times in recent memory in New York where everything has gone right. New York, much as I love it, New York generally specializes in screwing things up and doing things badly. And the High Line is the one time in which every single step of the process, the right thing has happened. So that has to be a little bit by accident, sort of like, all the monkeys who would eventually type Hamlet, I suppose, if it's sort of, but it did happen, and it's great, and we're all the luckier for it. So.
And I totally hear you on two people showing up who kind of don't know what they're doing and having a degree of success with it. It does strike me, though, that a lot of things happening in New York have a lot to do with Mayor Blumberg and also Amanda Burden being sort of very
Yes, I think
vocal
that's true.
advocates.
Right.
And I'm wondering if we can talk a bit about how does a city get that kind of advocate, which clearly, a Mayor Daley or someone who's
that's a great question. And by the way, I didn't mean to suggest that the two guys who did the High Line had bumbled their way into it. I mean, they are very smart, and they made a number of really intelligent strategic decisions. I meant only to say that they were not intimidated by if you're inside a field, sometimes you know too much about what can't be done and how hard it is. And they were not. So they are by no means, dumb hicks who just happen to do it. I mean, they are really smart, accomplished guys. And in fact, Mayor Bloomberg was a big part of the success of the High Line. The previous administration, Giuliani had planned to tear down the High Line. In fact, this is a great irony. He said, Chelsea's beginning to develop, but it's never going to get very far with this horrible blight in the middle of it, so we have to tear it down so the neighborhood can improve and redevelop. And now, of course, the most valuable property's value is in inverse proportion, or direct proportion to its closeness to the High Line. So it's exactly the opposite. It's being close to the High Line in Chelsea is like having a water view in San Francisco. I mean, it's so. Giuliani, thankfully, didn't quite get around to tearing it down. 9/11 got in the way and other things, and he was preoccupied and then left office. And Bloomberg came in and gave this sort of group that was trying to save it a fresh hearing. And Bloomberg was and is a great deal more enlightened on a lot of these matters. Remember, Bloomberg also reversed a previous administration's decision on Christo's project for Central Park, the gates, which had been turned down by a previous administration. And Bloomberg said, I think this is a great idea. Why aren't we doing this? It will, it's all to the good. They made a few changes which they thought would protect the landscape of the park better, and they ordered that it happen in February. The idea being that in New York, there's not a lot of other usage of the park in February, so it was not going to make it harder for people to sunbathe or play baseball or whatever in February, and it happened, and it was a great success. So Bloomberg, did have or does have a degree of, let's say, sophistication in these matters that some other mayors have not had, and so it was not that much of a surprise that he would give the High Line more consideration and ultimately agree to save it. And Amanda Burden, who has been the planning commissioner for his entire tenure as mayor, has turned out to have been an extraordinary advocate of good things in New York, and gradually has been making more and more of them happen, of which this is one, and her support has been a huge part of the High Line's success, and they created a new set of zoning laws around it to guide development and make sure it was protected and dealt with correctly. I think it does often come from the top. And, I wish I could say that it was easy to make that kind of commitment, but it's not. And in the same way that we all say it would be wonderful to have more CEOs who believed in design as a value in a corporation, both in terms of the corporation's headquarters and its products. There aren't enough of them who sort of see what it means or matters and what it can do and then change their mind. Most of the ones who have done important things kind of got it on their own somehow. And I mean, Amanda Burden is a remarkable woman who has done a phenomenal job. Mayor Bloomberg was a sophisticated, successful entrepreneur who had collected art and cared about visual things for a while. And so I wish I could say that it was because they read brilliant art and architecture criticism and sort of turned around.
Sure,
But
that
in
was
fact, maybe somewhere somebody did. But in general, I think the best stuff is done by people who sort of got it already. And that's an issue that I worry about and think about a lot, because I really care about convincing people that design matters and can make life a little better and so forth. And you want there to be a bigger audience and constituency for it. But exactly how you get a mayor, a CEO, or anyone else in authority to actually get it when they haven't already, I wish I knew. I wish I could say that you or me could say something brilliant that would turn them around. But I'm not convinced there is such a thing.
No, it's tricky. My favorite story on that front is I had a design consultant friend who, every client she had would come in and say, we want to be the Apple of X.
Right.
And someone came in once and said, we'd like to be the iPod of diapers. And she's like, you know what, I'm not going to be able to actually explain this to you in a way that's going to make sense. And I think their proposed product actually had some sort of sense, like electronic sensor. Did not go to market, clearly.
Right.
But deviating a bit, speaking of CEOs who understand design, maybe we could talk a bit about Apple, as we may in fact have some employees in the audience, as there's a lot of them in the city. What's your thought on the Norman Foster campus?
I'm very disappointed in the Norman Foster campus, and I say this as somebody who has huge admiration for Apple, which really does create the best designed consumer products in the world at this point, and has had more impact on the quality of design in the mass market than any company probably in history, and has done more to bring sophisticated modern design into everybody's life than any other company. And I have great admiration for Norman Foster, who I think is one of the great architects around today, and has done some of the best large-scale work. Somehow, the combination of Apple and Norman Foster, however, has not brought out the best in either one of them. And I think it's because Apple seemed to have had this idea that designing a headquarters is like designing the world's largest iPad or something like that. I mean, that it's an object. And a building is not just a perfectly designed object.
Right.
It is a much more complex set of things that has to do not only with how people function within it, but how it relates to the world around it. An iPad or an iPhone is a thing unto itself.
Right.
And it doesn't have to relate to where you put it or anything else.
No, it just has to be.
It just has to relate to you and your body and your use of it. A building has to connect to a place. It's not an object. This building that Foster has designed for Apple is sort of like a flying saucer that's kind of and then landed in Cupertino. And they somehow think this is all very cool, I think. I don't think it's very cool. I think it's kind of awful, actually, because I don't think it's what a building should be, however beautifully detailed it might be. And I also think that it will, by its very nature, reinforce the suburban, automobile-oriented culture of Silicon Valley, which needs to pull away from that. I think of what an incredible difference there could be if Apple, the most valuable company in the world, had said, okay, you know what, we're a few miles from San Jose, which is a not entirely healthy and wonderful city. Why don't we put our headquarters in the middle of San Jose and really make a difference? And then you'd have all these thousands of people working there. You'd have a beautiful building there. You'd have a reason for more people to live there. And you could turn that city around. Instead, they're actually adding to the force pulling away from San Jose, which will probably ultimately weaken it and put more traffic on the roads and do all these other things, all for this sort of beautiful object that you're not going to really be able to perceive as a beautiful object because no one's going to see it anyway,
Right.
and that misreads architecture. So I guess that means I'm not so fond of it, I guess. It's sort of, and as I said, I feel funny saying that because I really am, I mean, I have all Apple products myself. I, live with them. I love them. I use them all the time. I couldn't imagine buying anything else. And I really like Foster. But somehow, this has not been a marriage that has brought the best out of either one of them.
Well, it really is, as you said, as if they'd designed a giant iPod as opposed to anything that relates to anything around it. You've written before about how ultimately it's not the building itself that's so important, but the street. And here's an example where there really is no street.
There is no street. This is the flying saucer that just pops down anywhere. And it has nothing to do with a street or with any community or any surroundings at all.
Right.
It's also a reminder, I think, that no architect, no matter how good he or she is, can do their best work without the guidance of a client who's pushing in the right direction. And I don't think Apple wanted the things that you or I might want or value in this building. And that saddens me because I think, these are really smart people who you wish knew better and you wish their value system that is so attuned to design in the smaller sense of an object were equally attuned to design in the larger environmental sense. But they just don't seem to see it that way.
Well, it's interesting too. I'm thinking about the book, The Big Sort, which talks about how people are sort of self-selecting into neighborhoods and basically think exactly what the person who lives next to them do. And it feels like corporate campuses ultimately have this effect of just siphoning off people. So you're only surrounded by people who do exactly what you do and believe what you do.
And the whole idea of a city is that it's a mixing chamber.
Right.
That it mixes different kinds of people. And sure, neighborhoods are somewhat self-selective and all that. But you go out on the street and you see all kinds of other people and situations and different worlds. And you can't live in total isolation. But in fact, this Apple design, should it be built as planned, it seems to be all about isolation and inward looking and cutting oneself off from the world.
Well, it's interesting. You wrote a piece about how the cell phone is affecting the public realm, and just to make my next non sequitur from Apple to cell phones, we're all on our phones now as we walk down streets and are in public places, and you talk about how that's making us not notice the environment around us and as in some sense rendering the public realm more private. Maybe you could speak a bit to that.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think there's not today, most of us are not truly there wherever we are because we're somewhere else, and that's a problem. I mean, it's a danger with technology. Technology is in part. I mean, technology is a great enabler and a great gift, and none of us could or should want to live without it. But nothing is free, and part of the price we pay, I think, is this sense of being. With each new level of technology, we are that much more removed from the reality around us. Sometimes that's useful. Sometimes it enables us to do all kinds of wonderful things that we couldn't otherwise do. But sometimes it's also a problem. And we're not present in the sense that we want to be present as often as we should be because we're so often pulled in other directions and so forth. And I wish I had some brilliant explanation for how we can get ourselves out of that
Yeah, I mean, is there something...
without becoming Luddites, which
Right.
I don't want to be because I live on my technology as much as anybody else.
Right. Is there anything for an architect or planner to do? I mean, right now I feel like the best that anyone has done in terms of getting a phone and the person attached to it to interact with architecture is, you know, the little QR code so you can buy what you're looking at in the store window. Can we create something that is not just about shopping within that environment? You know, does it behoove the architect now to figure out how to create buildings and public spaces with that phone attachment in mind? You know, do you see any? I don't know what the answer is, but is it something that architects...
My sense is that we're trying harder than we used to, which is good, to create buildings and environments that do deal to at least some extent with the real and not the virtual, and show us the values of real places, the things that you cannot get from virtual experience, and that's all to the good. But we're all, you know, so attuned to this now that, you know, I mean, it makes me crazy when you go to a sporting event and you see people sitting in skyboxes watching a game on television that's going on real life, you know, real life right in front of them actually. But, you know, by now people think of the electronic image is almost more real to them than, now to some extent, that's been true for a long time. I mean, you know, people have always believed that there was a kind of vividness and aura and even power to people who they see on a screen, right? And, you know, you see somebody on television, then you see them on the sidewalk. Oh, my God, this is so exciting. I'm seeing blue, you know. And so, you know, this is a very exciting moment, even though, you know, it's just some person. Right. Except because they were on television, they seem to have a deeper, greater aura. So electronic media has always done this, but now that everybody is perpetually connected and seeing images of everybody else, the meaning of the real does seem to be a little bit diminished. Yet having said that, I want to say something else that maybe contradicts it slightly.
You're allowed.
You know, a long time ago when electronic things began to make their way into the realm of art museums, there was a lot of fear that this would diminish the experience of going to museums, that if you could see all this art online, if you could instantly call up a Matisse on your computer screen in bright color, why would you want to go to the museum anymore? In fact, of course, the opposite has happened.
Yep.
Seeing all of these images has only made people crave the real in some ways, the authentic even more. And, you know, now more people go to museums than ever to see the real thing that they have seen an image of before. So maybe somehow in all of this we are gradually getting toward an appreciation of real things because the virtual will take you only so far. And, you know, the virtual has to be the servant of the real. The real cannot be the servant of the virtual. And I think that's the challenge. And I think in the world of art museums, we've actually seen that kind of working pretty well now. You know, electronic images bring more people to come see the real thing. Will seeing images of each other on our iPhones all the time make us want to actually connect in real life more too? Will the virtual serve the real in that way? I hope so. It's too soon to tell because it's all evolving so much anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's manifesting itself in some ways with sort of DIY and tech shop and people making jam and tables and things like that. So that's one aspect.
Yeah, and you know, we also do have another set of cultural forces that exist, certainly in San Francisco, but also elsewhere, of the move toward, you know, handmade things, artisanal things. I mean, the word artisanal is almost becoming a trite cliche now, but it symbolizes something important that is different and distinct from the constant replication of an image electronically, and probably a very valuable balancing force in the culture right now.
And where do you see architecture falling in all of this right now? It feels like architecture goes through its periods of absolutely loving technology with, you know, the moment of the blob, and then sort of rediscovering materials, and I don't know exactly where it is right now. It's been a tough several years for architecture. So
well, it's been a tough several years for architecture because the thing that architecture follows far more than technology or style or fashion is money. And the economy. And the economy has not been so kind in the last few years. And when things are difficult, you know, people keep eating, they keep going to the movies, they keep doing some other things, but they don't build a lot of buildings.
Right.
You know, that's a building is the first thing to drop when times are tough, and the last thing to pick up on again when things begin to get better. So there's not, you know, architecture is particularly vulnerable to the economic downturn that we've been in for a while. So you know, that's really the greatest force that acts on architecture, I think. Technology, I think it's also important to remember that it affects architecture in two different ways. There's technology as part of the process of making buildings, and then there's technology as a sort of stylistic expression. So, you know, the blob stuff that you were talking about, buildings that were shaped sort of like this, was using technology, but using technology to sort of express some conceptual idea of technology too. So buildings would not feel like traditional buildings. They would symbolize something new and different. Technology is also used to produce buildings of a more traditional sort, and is an incredibly valuable tool. I mean, one of the really fascinating things today is the number of architects who are doing traditional work in various styles, whether it be classical or Victorian or Spanish Mediterranean or even Islamic and so forth, who are using advanced technological systems to actually produce those buildings. So their technology is not visible, it's not symbolized, but it's a critical part of the process. I think that is here permanently to stay, and while there are also some people who are trying to return to traditional means of building, and handmade, craft-like building, you might say, I think that's a very small segment. And I think, in general, technology is a significant part of the building process, no matter what kind of buildings you're doing. It's not as much of an aesthetic choice now because it doesn't actually, ironically, doesn't actually feel as fresh and new as it did a few years ago when the blob buildings seemed like hot stuff, but that's a decade already, right? Or something like that. And so now I've talked for several minutes and avoided actually committing to where it's going right now, of course, because, you know, the reality is I don't know. I mean, I don't.
You don't?
I mean, I don't. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm an honest man. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I can tell you. You know, that's why I didn't buy Facebook stock. You know, I mean, you know, I don't know. Thank goodness. But it, you know, I don't believe that things change as dramatically, stylistically, as a lot of people think they do. I think there is always a sort of ebb and flow and a gradual evolution, and things never repeat themselves exactly every time it looks like something's repeating. It's really incorporating other things and happening in a slightly different way. And the power of the pendulum is huge. We're seeing now a backlash against the open office,
Right.
because people are sort of
Hey, it's noisy in here.
realizing it's a little noisy, and a little bit of privacy isn't so bad. And as usual, we push things, to extremes, and now we're trying to come back to more of a midpoint, and so forth. So
You know that Raymond Loewy, the industrial designer who did the Lucky Strike logo and things like that, has this great maxim, Maya, most advanced yet acceptable, which
right,
I
right.
think sort of takes care of all this.
Well, but at most advanced yet acceptable is a really interesting point, because I think sometimes you measure a time as much by where its center is as where its extremes are.
Right.
And I mean, I don't believe that I'm not elevating the mainstream over the great creative work of any time or our time at all. But I'm saying, but sometimes where the mainstream is in fact particularly telling. And I'm also very interested in how very advanced things work their way down into the sort of mainstream or Maya, the most advanced yet acceptable level. I mean, we've seen that happen for a long time too. I mean, Mies van der Rohe was once very radical, and then it became, an acceptable corporate style and even a conservative style. And, we've seen other things migrate from being avant-garde into the mainstream, invariably being diluted each time, and rarely being strong examples any longer. But nevertheless, it's an interesting process to watch that happen. In the same way that watching political thought, say, go from political philosophy down into day-to-day politics is sort of an interesting process, even though it's a process of intellectual corruption a certain amount of time. Nevertheless, it's fascinating to see.
It is interesting to me how residential architecture seems to never get, though there's little exceptions along the way. When I was at Dwell, invariably I'd go to look at a house wherever it was, and people would never have to give me the address because it was always the one house on the street that looked completely different than everything else. And the neighbors would always say, that thing looks like a spaceship. And that was the kind of catch-all phrase for anything that didn't look like everything else.
Right.
And I was always amazed that it didn't matter who the potential client or even home buyer was. They could have been, a Facebook executive or whoever. They still, sort of the markers of success seem to be very much about traditional architecture, and that it has slowly, you can have, an open plan living room and dining room, you can have an iPad in your refrigerator, but God, the outside better be Spanish Gothic or it's not okay.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't go quite so far as to say that acceptance of modernism is in inverse proportion to the size of someone's bank account. But there are moments when one's almost tempted to say that. It's very interesting in New York to observe that while in the boom of the last decade up to 2008, there have been an awful lot of really fancy, high-end, expensive condos built, including, the Richard Meier buildings and the Jean Nouvel building and everyone else's building. The one that has been the most successful, that has made the most money, is Robert A.M. Stern's building at 15 Central Park West, which is limestone and a knockoff of a 1920s traditional apartment house. Right. And that's the one that all the hedge fund people were falling all over themselves to get into, and where the prices were bid up to the point of, it became a commodity more than real estate, and people were trading apartments before the building was finished. Yeah. And that's a very conservative building. Yep. It was for what it is, it's not badly done. It's actually pretty well done. But it sort of set what was, in some ways a discouraging conclusion to reach, which is that when people have this much money, they really want something very traditional and not something fresh and new. Yeah.
But as long as they're not living in it, then they might go the other way. And so we'll finish before we take questions, and we can talk a little bit about Frank Gehry and what it's like to delve into the realm of biography.
Delving into the realm of biography is a whole new experience for me, definitely. I've been writing about architecture for a long time now. I've never tried to write about somebody's life and how it connects to their work, which is why I want to do this book, actually. It was not just because of Frank Gehry, who I do admire, but it was more about the opportunity to really think about all these different issues of somebody's life. And I do have this great fear now of sinking into a Robert Caro quicksand of sort of so many years of research, which I don't have the temperament, unlike him, to do. I'm too impatient by nature, I think. So if I'm still working on this thing in 15 years, I'm going to want somebody to shoot me. But at this point, it's early enough, and I'm still researching it and not yet writing anything. So I'm very excited by the challenge of looking at somebody's life. And I'm not even actually yet thinking very much. I've been thinking about his architecture for a long time because I've known it. I guess our careers, he's a lot older than I am, but my career started sort of around the time that he was becoming a bigger figure. So in that sense, we kind of grew up in a parallel way. And he has always fascinated me as a sort of character and as somebody with a really extraordinary combination of driven ambition and kind of aw shucks desire to be liked very much. And he really gets upset when people kind of don't get his work and really wants it to communicate clearly. And for some people it does, and other people it doesn't. But it's not surprising that he did Bilbao, which is the most, let's say, the most emphatic and clear intersection in the last generation or more of avant-garde design and popular taste. It's where those two things actually, which do not often meet, did meet and intersect. And so and that's actually, in many ways, what interests me most about Gehry is, get back to that whole idea of the mainstream again. And that Frank Gehry was able to pull mainstream taste briefly into the avant-garde. And how that was achieved and why fascinates me as a sort of cultural moment, let's say. And so I want this book to try to explore all those things, as well as deal with how likable, slightly neurotic Jewish guy from Toronto becomes this hot Los Angeles architect. And so, so I'm having fun with it. Right now I'm thinking more about trying to learn more details about his grandmother in Toronto than about his clients in Los Angeles. But that's, we'll get on to the next phase soon, I hope.
Well, we can't wait to see it.
So,
well, great.
Yeah.
We can take some questions from the audience. It's very hard to see, but
just got easier. Okay.
oh, sorry. You can.
First question is right here. Does mic work?
Thank you for talking. I wonder if you'd say a few words about the desirability of architectural competition with major public buildings and cities. I mean, we're cursed with an art museum that was a product of a designated architect by the very wealthy donor who fundraised the de Young, of course, in Golden Gate Park. And so I wonder if you'd say, I'd like to hear what you have. I'd like to hear. I'd like to hear what you have to say about architectural competition,
Sure,
both pro
sure.
and con.
Okay. I don't know that I would say you're cursed with the de Young, actually. I mean, I actually,
You
I mean,
could do much worse.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I will concede that that building has some issues, but yes, you could do worse. Let's leave it at that. And in fact, some people would say you did do worse downtown, actually. So, but
Bring it on, people.
yeah, right. So I don't know. But leaving that aside for a moment to go to the more general question, you know, there are. It is often disappointing and unfortunate when a donor makes a unilateral decision, and I find it unfortunate when an institution lets that be the process. Sometimes by luck, the result is okay, but it's not the best way to achieve that result. But there are a number of other ways to go about this process, and an open competition, which is a very traditional way, holds great possibility and potential, is also an extremely cumbersome and difficult way to go about a process, and I'm not surprised that not that many institutions choose to do open competitions, which is basically, you know, allowing anybody to submit a design, and they're submitted blind and unmarked and just numbered, and then a jury evaluates them theoretically, having no idea who did what, and then chooses the best one. There's another problem with that system, besides the fact that it's complicated and cumbersome to administer, which is that it involves no meaningful dialogue or give and take between the client and the architect. And the reality is, no architect does his or her best work in isolation. Every good building that I know is a product of a discourse and a dialogue between a client and an architect. And let me go back to Frank Gehry, who is, in fact, for all people think of him as a strong-willed, creative force, which he is somebody who revels in discussions with clients and never likes to begin a project without long, intense, almost psychoanalytic conversations with clients about what they want, what they think they're getting, what they hope for, what they need, what they like, what they don't like, and so forth. When you do a competition, you know, there's none of that. It's all kind of, everybody's working in isolation. There's an in-between process that I've seen work pretty well from time to time, and which is a kind of limited invited competition, where a client looks at several architects, narrows the field, interviews several, and then brings it down to a sort of manageable group of 3 or 4 or 5 and asks each of them to submit a proposal that comes out of some discussion that they have together. So there is some experience of give and take, and then ultimately chooses one to move forward with. That's also cumbersome, but you know, I've been privileged sometimes to advise some institutions on that, going through that kind of process, and it also can be very exciting and has sometimes yielded some wonderful things. So there's no fail-safe, perfect way to ever go about choosing an architect, however, and sometimes the very best institutions have made mistakes. Sometimes they have even had to change course in midstream. Certainly in this city, there have been a couple of institutions from time to time that have hired architects and fired them before building anything and gone to somebody else. And I know that the Morgan Library in New York had a limited invited competition, had 3 very good architects, each do a design. They studied all three of them. They had further meetings with all three. They had a whole dialogue. They asked each of them to revise it according to their concerns. All three came back. The Morgan Library finally decided they really didn't like any of them and started all over again. So, but that took a lot of time and a lot of money to do that, and it threw the project a year behind. It's not an easy situation under any circumstances. And I can understand the temptation of an institution to say, we're just going to go to him because the donor wants him and that'll save us all a lot of trouble. Usually that's not the best thing either. So anyway.
Next question is up here. Great.
Hi. In the beginning, you talked about municipalities making very bad decisions that we end up having to live with. And in the news recently, there's been talk, the Golden Gate Warriors are going to come to San Francisco. And Mayor Ed Lee is talking about giving space on the Embarcadero for a basketball arena where when people are in the building, they're not looking at the view. And it's a very heavily congested area. What do we do to stop this?
It would be sort of, the ultimate irony if after achieving the great triumph many years ago to national admiration of getting rid of the freeway on the Embarcadero, you should end up with an arena instead. I mean, for what did all this effort go if it's then, the freeway goes down and an arena goes up? You're right. I mean, that would be a terrible use of that land. I don't know. I mean, get Allison to write about it. Get John King to write about it. What can there are a lot of respected local voices here, and I hope that they would speak out if this is really a serious proposal. It's all well.
The quote in the paper
Okay.
today was, "This is going to happen."
Okay.
Yes.
Well, that's.
So we shall see.
Who was the person quoted as saying that? The mayor or
Not the mayor. Someone in the audience can correct me. It was the team owner. Yes.
the team owner?
Well, of course
Okay.
he's going to say that, but it was sort
Right,
of like
right. He's on, yeah, right. What else is he going to say? Gee, maybe, please. Team owners don't say that. I mean, I'm not going to comment on the general idea of bringing the team here, which might well be a very good thing. This may not be the biggest city in the world, but it ought to have some places other than the waterfront to put an arena. It seems to me. I mean, isn't there some piece of Mission Bay that isn't spoken for yet? Actually, which would be kind of nice actually to have there. I would think. So.
Next question is up here.
Historic preservation is now about 50 years old, and in the last 10 years there have been articles and books critiquing it and suggesting changes and so forth. And of course there's controversies. You've had them in New York, we have them here.
Sure.
What's your take on the state of historic preservation?
I think in general it's okay. I mean, there's a lot of it. I don't think there's. I think we could talk about specific situations of which there are many to differ about, perhaps. I don't believe that historic preservation, as some people have suggested, has become too powerful, and that we're not building enough new stuff, and that we're not interested enough in new design. I think that's generally a pile of crap, basically, that argument. I think the great challenge in historic preservation right now is modernist preservation. There's an awful lot of modern buildings, many of which people have not grown up particularly liking or admiring, that are now moving into the realm of being historical artifacts, and not all, but many of them are really deserving of being preserved, and they are a tough sell sometimes. I mean, there's a particularly tough battle in Chicago right now over Bertrand Goldberg's Prentice Hospital. There's a tough battle in New York, not New York City, but upstate, over a wonderful Paul Rudolph building that was the Orange County Government Center that may not be quite as important as Frank Lloyd Wright's Marin County Government Center, but is the same kind of building from the 70s that the county executive wants to tear down and replace with a little Georgian building with red brick and white shutters, which would be a most unfortunate thing, and particularly because I think the Rudolph building, while it has some problems and issues, really does symbolize the idea that government can be a creative, imaginative force, that government was interested in being a patron of the new in a good way. We don't see a lot of examples of that anymore, particularly given, in the age of the Tea Party, let's say, particularly don't. And so I hope that that can be preserved. So modernist preservation in a lot of ways is the biggest challenge. I believe that no city other than maybe colonial Williamsburg is a museum, or should be, that it is essential, no matter how passionately you believe in preservation, to continually support the new, because a city is a living object. A city is not a museum. And in fact, it's important to be aware that we have to be thinking of the landmarks of the future as well, and creating an ongoing supply of things that the next generation can argue about and want to preserve, and not feel as if you're living only in a museum. Nevertheless, that line you could take out of context and use inappropriately to support any new project, many of which might be misguided and so forth. So I say that with caution, because I think to say no city is a museum, every city needs to support the new, could also be taken out of context as an anti-historic preservation argument, and I'm actually a trustee of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, so I wouldn't be allowed to say that even if I wanted to. And I believe profoundly in preservation. I just also believe in balance, and I think it's impossible to talk about the idea of balance in a general or generic way. We can only talk about balance in terms of specific situations. So.
Next question is way up here in the back.
Sure. My question actually kind of hinges on the comments that you've just been making. San Francisco, I think, is fairly, infamous for having a fairly NIMBY culture.
Right.
Particularly when it comes to architecture. I know a very talented office here in the city that was hired after the original architects were fired by Don Fisher to design the Contemporary Art Museum in the Presidio. And the resistance from the community was so strong that it ultimately killed the project. Although they didn't really have a direct vote, the Presidio Trust elected not to go forward with it,
right,
because of the controversies. And so I guess my question is really, like, what do you feel are the limits of public interaction in being able to drive a piece of architecture? I think that, you probably agree, almost every piece of architecture, every good piece of architecture is somewhat controversial. So shouldn't we allow people like trustees of the de Young to make what some might be considered to be a mistake, or that we hold or reserve judgment for something that's going to happen on the Embarcadero before we really know what its impact is going to be? I think that probably before the baseball stadium, AT&T Park was built. Now, it's no great feat of architecture, but as a social instrument, it actually is quite something, and it spurred an incredible South of Market development that's really brought a part of the city that wasn't a viable community before to be one. So I just like to expand on that.
I think AT&T Park actually is pretty decent, and is probably at this point, maybe, in terms of urban integration, it's actually the best new ballpark in the country, and the one that actually does the most for the city and integrates best with the city and so forth. So I wouldn't sell AT&T short at all, actually. although I don't think I'd credit it with the whole south of Market growth either. I think it is as much effect as cause. You know, it happened because things were already happening, and then it reinforced them and pushed them farther, which is a great thing, and that's how things should happen. I think you've kind of, if I could say this, kind of conflated a few different situations. I think the issue with the Presidio and the Fisher Museum was not so much about specific architecture as just about the idea of putting a museum there and having a large public institution in that part of the city on that piece of land, which is a planning decision as much as it is more than an architectural decision. And I don't think, I may be wrong, but I don't think it turned on the specifics of the architecture so much as the idea of putting something there. Similarly, I think the question of the arena on the Embarcadero is also a kind of planning decision, knowing that, you know, there's no way anybody that it is not possible to make a professional basketball arena that is the size of a house. Inevitably, it would be a very large thing that no matter who designed it, no matter what it looked like, it ain't going to be the size of a Victorian house in the Haight. You know, it's going to be something else. So whether it's possible to make it viable on that site is a planning decision as much as an architectural decision. So I wouldn't conflate those two things. I think in the case of the de Young, however, that was an architectural decision and not a planning decision. And you're right, I think it was appropriate to let the board make its decision and take its chances and so forth. But now, the bigger question you're asking is how much public input should there be? There should be more than there once was, and there should be less than there sometimes is. I mean, I sort of don't know how else to put it. I mean, democracy is a great thing. It is not always the very best thing for architecture and planning, however. Do we want to give it up? No. Do we have to pay a price for it? Yes. In the same way that, you know, democracy doesn't always bring us the best results in a lot of areas. Nevertheless, you know, we're not about to pack it in and try some other system. I think any city, any community, though, has to have a certain overall authority making certain planning and architectural judgments because of the very force that you referred to at the beginning of your question, which is sort of NIMBYism. Nobody is going to want to have certain things near them, but those things have to exist somewhere. And somebody has to play the heavy, somebody has to be the grown-up and say it's going to go here. But that it is not an honorable or proper or civilized or decent way to do that without at least some degree of significant listening, input, and understanding of the larger forces, both economic, social, and architectural, that exist in the makeup of a community and city. You know, and I realize that that's not a particularly that's a slightly fuzzy answer, but because I don't think there's any way it can be otherwise. It's nice to talk about the glories of democracy, but it creates some problems. It's also nice to talk about the glorious results that dictatorship can bring in architecture and planning from time to time, but you know, that's not the answer either. Ultimately, we need some combination of, I guess, what we'd have to call enlightened, serious planning that is decisive, is able to take larger issues into account, but does listen and does think of the overall implications of any one decision on both an immediate neighborhood and a larger city.
We'll take one more question.
So last question is back here.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned Marin County Civic Center as an example of obviously some must-see kind of architecture. I'm just wondering what else you would consider must-see here in San Francisco or Bay Area in terms of architecture.
New, old, anything, you mean? Well, let's see. We talked about the bridge, of course, which is one of the greatest things of all. I actually, over the years, have sort of, now I'll mention a couple of things in the order I think of them, which is not in any possible way an order of preference, because I was about to say, you know, I've sort of over the years made a peace with the Transamerica building, but I don't want anybody to say I said that was the best building in San Francisco. But in a weird way, you know, I have this sort of sense you can kind of get used to anything, and that building has sort
The
of
highest compliment.
that building does have this sort of quirky, weird way of kind of at the end of the day.
It's got a personality.
It's got a personality. We're all kind of used to it, and I sort of like the fact that the ultimate Los Angeles building was built in San Francisco, actually. Because if any of you know the building in downtown Los Angeles, the old Bradbury building, that's really the ultimate San Francisco building that happens to be in Los Angeles. So it's only fair that the ultimate Los Angeles building be in San Francisco. I've always thought, seriously though, that the greatness of San Francisco was not individual buildings. It's the sort of sense of what in New Orleans they used to call the tout ensemble, the collective whole of the city, the beauty of the streets, the combination of, you know, particularly the Victorian houses, which are probably most vivid in people's minds, but also the strength of so many of the neighborhoods, the beauty of Russian Hill, I have a particular fondness also for Pacific Heights and some of the Willis Polk houses, the shingled houses that are there, and so forth. I love the Mabeck Palace of Fine Arts, as well as the Mabeck buildings in Berkeley. But for me, it's really always been the totality of this city and the amazing way in which the man-made and the natural make something incredible in this city. You know, I mean, in a way, what I said about the Golden Gate Bridge, you could really almost say about the city as a whole. Mm-hmm. That, you know, here is this unbelievably beautiful natural place that actually, in a wonderful way, becomes more beautiful by what people built on it. And that there are very few places in the world you can say that about, and certainly very few in this country. So for me, it's really the whole of San Francisco that is the great work of architecture more than specific buildings. But that's what, in a way, you almost want to feel about a city, and it's what you can say about too few American cities. Mm-hmm. So it's what, for me, makes this very special.
What a wonderful note to end on. Thanks to all of you for being here. Don't forget books signing in the atrium. Thanks to Allison Arieff and most of all, Paul Goldberger. Thank you so much.
Thank you.